It was late afternoon when Mike arrived at Willow Lake. He always enjoyed fishing there, a quiet and secluded spot where he could be alone. The trees around cast shadows over the water, but for Mike, that was normal. He was used to the silent and somewhat gloomy atmosphere of the lake. Mike was about 15 or 16 years old at the time, just a teenager who enjoyed fishing. That day, he was alone, as usual. He sat on the shore, his fishing rod ready, leaning against a tree root that jutted out from the ground and dipped into the water. Everything was calm, until a strong, unpleasant smell began to rise from the lake. Mike wrinkled his nose, trying to identify where the horrible smell was coming from. He looked at the tree root and noticed that the smell seemed to be coming from beneath it. Curious, he got up and went to the edge of the lake. The water was dark, and he tried to see what was down there, thinking it might be a dead animal caught in the root. But the water was deeper than he imagined, and he couldn't see anything. Feeling a chill, Mike decided it was better not to mess with it alone. He turned and ran to get his stepfather, who was camping not far from there. Mike arrived at the campsite almost out of breath. His stepfather was sitting in a folding chair, preparing the grill for dinner. He looked up when he saw Mike approaching with a worried expression on his face. "What's wrong, kid?" his stepfather asked, somewhat suspiciously. "There's something in the lake under that root, a horrible smell." "I think it might be a dead animal or something," Mike replied, still trying to catch his breath. His stepfather sighed and slowly stood up. He had always been a practical man, hard to impress. He grabbed a flashlight and followed Mike to the lake without a word. But Mike could sense that he wasn't taking it too seriously. When they reached the shore, the smell was still there, strong and unpleasant. The stepfather turned on the flashlight and illuminated the water near the tree root. He stepped into the water, which was cold, and began to probe the area with the flashlight, searching for the source of the odor. Mike watched in silence, hoping it was just a dead animal, nothing more. He saw his stepfather move closer to the root and suddenly stop moving. The flashlight flickered for a second, and his stepfather stood still, staring intently at something in the water. "What is it?" Mike asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. The stepfather didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, as if he had seen a ghost. He looked at Mike with an expression the boy had never seen before, a mix of fear and disbelief. "There's nothing here," the stepfather finally said, but there was something in his voice that suggested otherwise. "But I saw something. It looked like a girl. But it can't be," he murmured almost to himself, before hurrying out of the water. Mike tried to ask what he had seen, but his stepfather just kept repeating that there was nothing, as if trying to convince himself. The two returned to the campsite in silence, but the smell in the lake and the strange vision his stepfather had didn't leave Mike's mind. Something was very wrong with that place, and he had the feeling that this wouldn't be the end of the story. Back at the campsite, the atmosphere was tense. Mike's stepfather was visibly shaken, but he tried to hide it. While they were preparing dinner, he spoke little, and when he did, he avoided mentioning what he had seen in the lake. Mike, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about it. After a quick meal, the stepfather walked away to smoke a cigarette, staring at the lake as if he was having a silent conversation with it. Mike knew that something was very wrong, but he still didn't understand what. "You really didn't see anything down there, did you?" Mike asked, breaking the silence that seemed to grow denser by the minute. The stepfather hesitated before answering. He took a drag from his cigarette, his eyes fixed on the darkness. "It was just my imagination, Mike. There's nothing there. It was just a shadow, I think." But the way he avoided Mike's gaze said otherwise. Something had deeply disturbed him, and Mike knew he had to find out what it was. The next morning, while his stepfather was still asleep, Mike decided to return to the lake. He was determined to understand what had happened the night before. He grabbed the flashlight his stepfather had used and followed the same path back to the shore. The daylight didn't make the place seem any less frightening. If anything, Willow Lake looked even more ominous in the morning sun. Mike approached the tree root where his stepfather had stopped the night before and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the water. For a few seconds, he saw nothing unusual. The water was dark and calm, as always. But then, as the flashlight beam passed under the root, something began to take shape. It was a figure, a vague silhouette, almost indistinct. Mike leaned closer, trying to understand what he was seeing, and then suddenly the figure became clearer. It was a girl, or at least it seemed to be. Her hair floated around her pale face, and her eyes were open, but lifeless, fixed on something beyond Mike. He stepped back, his heart racing. The image disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness of the water. Mike blinked, trying to process what he had just seen. He felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't a shadow or a reflection. It was something real, or at least it seemed to be. Mike knew he had to tell his stepfather. But at the same time, he knew the story was far from over. Something much darker was happening at that lake, and now he was involved, whether he wanted to be or not. Mike ran back to the campsite with his heart pounding, his hands trembling as he still held the flashlight. He knew what he had seen wasn't a product of his imagination. The image of that girl in the water was etched into his mind, and he needed answers. His stepfather was sitting by the extinguished campfire, drinking coffee. When he saw Mike approaching, he frowned. "What are you doing up so early?" he asked, but his voice showed more concern than curiosity. "I went back there," Mike replied, trying to control his breathing. I saw a girl under the water." "You saw her too, didn't you?" The stepfather remained silent for a moment, staring at the cup in his hands. Finally, he sighed and looked up at Mike. "I saw something, yes, but it doesn't make sense, Mike. It can't be real." Mike sat down beside his stepfather, still feeling the weight of what he had witnessed. "But it was real. She was there, trapped under the root. Who is she?" The stepfather ran his hand over his face, as if trying to organize his thoughts. She reminded me of someone," he began hesitantly, "of a girl named Mary." "Mary?" Mike repeated, the word sounding strange on his lips. The stepfather nodded slowly. "This happened a few years ago, before you and your mother moved here. Mary was a teenager from our town. One day, she disappeared without a trace. No one knew what had happened to her. Her parents searched everywhere, but they never found her. It was a shock to everyone." "But what does that have to do with what we saw in the lake?" Mike asked, trying to understand the connection. "I don't know," the stepfather replied, shaking his head. "But that girl, she looked a lot like Mary. It can't be a coincidence. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense that she was there. If it were her body, it would already be." He didn't finish the sentence, but Mike knew what he meant. If Mary's body had been in that lake for so long, it would be in a much worse state than what they had seen. "What are we going to do?" Mike asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. The stepfather was silent for a long time before answering. "I think we should go home and call the police. They need to investigate this. But, Mike, don't tell your mother about what we saw. At least, not until we know exactly what's going on." Mike agreed, though he knew it wouldn't be easy to keep this secret. As they packed up the campsite to leave, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the lake. Something inside him told him that this story was far from over. Back in town, Mike and his stepfather drove in silence to the police station. Their stepfather insisted on going in alone to speak with the sheriff, leaving Mike waiting in the car. He sat there, restless, watching people pass by on the street, but his mind was trapped in what he'd seen at the lake. After what felt like an eternity, the stepfather returned, his face serious. "They're going to send a team to investigate the lake," he said, not looking directly at Mike. "But until then, don't say anything about this to anyone, understand?" Mike nodded, but he knew this wasn't the end. Something deeper was hidden in this story, and he was determined to find out what it was. That night at home, Mike couldn't sleep. His stepfather's words kept echoing in his head. "She looked a lot like Mary." Who was Mary, really? What happened to her? Why was his stepfather so shaken by all this? The next day, while his stepfather was at work, Mike started researching. He went to the local library and searched through the old newspaper archives. It didn't take long to find the headline he was looking for. "Teenager missing. Mystery surrounds the case of Mary Smith." The news was from a few years ago. Mary Smith was 17 years old when she disappeared. She was described as a popular girl with many friends and no apparent enemies. Her family had reported her missing after she didn't return home from a party at a friend's house. The entire town had participated in the search, but they never found any trace of Mary. Her disappearance became a mystery that still haunted the community. As he read more about the case, Mike felt a chill when he saw a photo of Mary next to the article. She had the same face he saw underwater at Willow Lake. It was her, no doubt about it. But the more he researched, the more questions arose. What happened to Mary that night? Why was her body in the lake? And why did his stepfather seem so affected by all this? Mike decided that he needed to confront his stepfather. That night after dinner, he called him for a talk. "I looked into Mary," Mike began, seeing his stepfather's expression harden. "I know it was her we saw in the lake, but I don't understand. Why were you so shaken? You knew her, didn't you?" The stepfather was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. Finally, he sighed and looked at Mike, his eyes filled with a pain he was clearly trying to hide. "Yes, I knew Mary," he admitted, his voice low. "But there's more to it, Mike. That night when she disappeared, I was with her." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. He never imagined his stepfather could be involved somehow. "Well, I was with her at the party," the stepfather continued, his voice trembling slightly. "We were friends, just friends. But that night, something went wrong. Mary and I argued over something silly and she ran off. I followed her to the lake, trying to apologize. But when I got there, she was already in the water, and I couldn't save her. I watched her drown, Mike, and I didn't tell anyone." Mike was speechless. The revelation hit him like a weight, leaving him dizzy. "I was so scared," the stepfather said, tears beginning to roll down his face. "I thought that if I told the truth, no one would believe me, that they'd think I hurt her. So I pretended nothing happened. But now she's back, and I don't know what it means." Mike remained silent, trying to process it all. He didn't know whether to feel anger, fear, or sadness. But one thing was certain. Mary's spirit was haunting Willow Lake, and now that the truth was beginning to come to light, what else could she want? The words of his stepfather echoed in Mike's mind, blending with the disturbing images he couldn't forget. Mary's pale face, her empty eyes, and the guilt etched on his stepfather's face created a sense of urgency that he couldn't ignore. He knew he had to return to Willow Lake, even if it meant facing his worst fears. That night, Mike waited until his mother went to bed. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep with the weight of what he had discovered, so he grabbed a flashlight and quietly left the house. His stepfather had returned to work and wouldn't be home until later, giving him the time he needed. The walk to Willow Lake seemed longer than usual, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. When he reached the shore, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant owl. The air was cold, and a mist began to form over the water's surface, making the atmosphere even more eerie. Mike turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the water, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know exactly what he was expecting, but he was sure something would happen that night. Suddenly, the water began to ripple. Small waves appeared out of nowhere, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Mike leaned forward, the flashlight trembling in his hand, and then she appeared. Mary's silhouette slowly emerged, her hair floating around her pale face. She looked clearer than before, as if the mist was molding her. Her lifeless eyes fixed on Mike, and he felt a deep, almost paralyzing fear take hold of his body. But he knew he couldn't run. Mary was there for a reason, and he needed to understand what she wanted. "Mary," Mike whispered, feeling his throat dry. "What do you want? Why are you here?" The answer came as a whisper in the breeze, almost imperceptible. The truth. At that moment, Mike's stepfather appeared at the edge of the lake, out of breath. He had followed the boy, unable to stay home, with the weight of the secret he had kept for so many years. When he saw Mary's silhouette, his face contorted into a mix of fear and regret. I'm sorry, Mary," he said, his voice laden with pain. "I should have told the truth from the beginning. I should have saved you. But I was a coward. And now, you're stuck here because of me." Mary's silhouette floated for a moment before beginning to dissolve, as if the mist was slowly consuming her. But before she completely disappeared, she moved closer to the shore, looking directly into Mike's stepfather's eyes. "Go away," the voice whispered once more, and then she dissolved into the water, disappearing completely. The lake returned to silence as if nothing had happened. Mike and his stepfather stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do or say. But there was a sense of closure in the air, as if Mary had finally found the peace she had been seeking. "She's gone," Mike whispered, feeling tears stream down his face. The stepfather nodded, his expression relieved but still somber. "Yes, she's gone. But what we did today was the right thing." The two turned and began to walk back home. The weight of guilt seemed to have lessened, but the stepfather knew he would never completely free himself from the responsibility of what happened. Mike, on the other hand, felt that he had done something important. He had not only helped uncover the truth, but he had also helped Mary's soul find rest. When they arrived home, the stepfather made a promise to himself. He would tell the truth no matter what it cost. And Mike, though that experience had marked him deeply, knew he would always remember that night at Willow Lake as the moment he faced his greatest fears and, in some way, helped to right a wrong from the past. Hoa, liganis chaitilas monanteren sonda. Three friends decided to spend the weekend fishing at a remote lake that one of them had recently discovered. The plan was simple: escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and enjoy the tranquility of nature. The lake was isolated, far from the city, surrounded by dense forests. It was the kind of place where no one passed by accidentally. When they arrived, the lake seemed calm, almost too serene. The water was a perfect mirror, reflecting the tall trees that surrounded it. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of a bird or the rustling of leaves. The setting seemed ideal for a weekend of fishing and relaxation. As they set up camp, one of the friends, who seemed more attuned to the details around them, began to feel a slight unease. It was as if something or someone was watching them. He looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The other two were excited, laughing and making plans for what they expected to be a memorable fishing trip. Ignoring the strange feeling, he continued to help with the preparations. With everything ready, the three settled by the lake, ready to cast their lines and wait for the fish to bite. Despite the peaceful environment, there was something in the air that bothered the more sensitive friend. The silence didn't seem natural, and the shadows of the trees, as the sun set, gave the place a slightly darker aspect. As daylight faded and night approached, the feeling of being watched persisted, but none of them wanted to admit they were starting to feel uncomfortable. After all, they were there to relax and enjoy nature, not to worry about superstitions or unfounded fears. With the camp set up and the fishing rods in place, night began to fall over the lake. The sky was clear, revealing an infinity of stars, but the darkness around them was dense, almost tangible. The three friends gathered around a small fire they had lit to ward off the night's chill. The conversation flowed naturally, but there was a tension in the air that no one mentioned. As they talked, one of the friends, the most observant, noticed something strange on the other side of the lake. On the opposite shore, a solitary figure was sitting, apparently fishing. The moonlight vaguely illuminated the scene, but not enough to reveal details. "Look over there," he said, pointing to the figure. "It looks like we're not alone." The other two friends looked in the direction he was pointing. The figure was motionless, almost blending with the surrounding darkness. They waved and called out, but there was no response. The figure simply continued sitting, fishing rod in hand, as if unaware of their presence. "It must be another fisherman," one of the friends suggested, trying to deflect the growing discomfort. "But why isn't he responding?" the other asked, frowning. The third friend, the one who had felt the unease earlier, felt a chill run down his spine. Something didn't seem right. The figure on the other side of the lake seemed oblivious to the world around him, as if trapped in an endless routine, with no interest in what was happening around him. As the night wore on, a mist began to form over the lake's surface, making the figure even more indistinct. Within minutes, it had disappeared completely into the mist, leaving the friends alone once again. They exchanged nervous glances, but no one wanted to admit they were scared. After all, they were there to fish, not to be swayed by superstitions. They decided to ignore the strange encounter and focus on what they had planned. But as the night continued, the lake seemed increasingly strange, as if something invisible was moving in the shadows. And although they didn't say it out loud, they all knew that the mysterious figure was far from forgotten. The next morning, the three friends woke up early, still uneasy about what they had witnessed the night before. Although none of them wanted to admit it, the solitary figure they had seen by the lake continued to occupy their thoughts. They decided to investigate the spot where they had seen it, hoping to find some explanation that could ease the tension they were feeling. After a quick breakfast, they grabbed their backpacks and walked to the opposite shore of the lake. The air was damp and cold, and the morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing the landscape around them. When they reached the spot, they were surprised to find an old, rusty fishing chair and an ancient fishing rod leaning against a nearby tree. "This must have been here for years," one of the friends commented, as he carefully examined the chair. "But who was using it last night?" Another friend picked up the fishing rod and noticed that it was covered in rust, clearly abandoned a long time ago. This doesn't make sense. We saw someone here last night, but these things look like they've been left here for decades. The third friend, who had been suspicious from the start, felt a chill as he observed the scene. I don't like this. Something is very wrong. If the person we saw was using these things, how are they in this state? They searched the area for more clues, but found no recent signs of human activity. No tracks, no evidence that anyone had been there the night before. Just the chair and the fishing rod, as if they had been forgotten in time. After a while, they decided to return to the camp. The atmosphere among them was heavy, and the silence replaced the animated conversations they had had the day before. They were all trying to understand what had happened, but no explanation seemed satisfactory. That night, they decided to continue fishing, trying to lift their spirits. But as the sun began to set and the shadows stretched across the lake, the tension began to rise again. The friend who had felt the strange presence the night before began to feel once more as though he was being watched. He looked to the other side of the lake, but this time he saw nothing. Even so, the feeling that someone or something was nearby was undeniable. The air seemed colder, and the silence of the night was interrupted only by the soft sound of the water moving. As he cast his line into the water, he felt something pass by his side. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The discomfort was growing, and he began to wonder if they were alone on that lake. In the growing darkness, he could barely see his friends. But what really disturbed him was what he couldn't see. That invisible presence seemed more real, closer, and he knew that something was about to happen. Night fell quickly, and with it came an unsettling silence. The three friends were again by the lake, trying to focus on fishing, but the atmosphere was very different from the previous nights. The discovery of the abandoned chair and fishing rod was still on their minds, and the tension was almost palpable. The friend who had felt the strange presence on previous nights was especially nervous. He kept constantly looking around, expecting to see something or someone emerge from the shadows. And then, as if his worst fears were coming true, he finally saw it. The figure was back. At first, it was just an indistinct shadow on the opposite shore of the lake, almost blending with the surrounding darkness. But as his eyes adjusted to the lack of light, the figure became clearer. It was the same man they had seen before, still sitting silently, apparently fishing, but now something was different. The moonlight reflected on his skin in a strange way, giving him a pale and almost translucent appearance. He seemed to be wearing old clothes, very different from what anyone would wear today. His clothes were soaked as if he had just come out of the water, and there was something about the way he moved, or rather the lack of movement, that made the friend's blood run cold. He tried to get the others' attention, but his voice failed him. When he finally managed to point to the figure, the other two friends turned and saw what he was looking at. They all fell silent, watching the figure of the ghost fisherman. Suddenly, the figure slowly stood up, as if aware that it was being watched. The fisherman began to walk toward the lake, but his movements were slow, almost mechanical. Without warning, he stepped into the water without hesitation and continued walking until he disappeared completely beneath the surface. The friends were in shock, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. None of them could believe what their eyes had seen. But the fear on each other's faces confirmed that it wasn't a collective hallucination. It was real, and they knew that whatever it wasn't a living person. The silence was broken by the sound of the water, which seemed to return to normal after the strange event. The three friends exchanged looks, but none of them knew what to say. They all wanted to leave as quickly as possible, but fear kept them frozen in place. Finally, the friend who had first seen the figure managed to speak. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, as if afraid that the ghost fisherman might hear them. The others quickly agreed and began to gather their things as fast as they could. But as they packed up the camp, one question hung in the air, unspoken but clearly present. What had they just seen? And more importantly, what did the ghost fisherman want? The friends barely slept that night. The image of the ghost fisherman walking into the water wouldn't leave their minds. However, despite the fear and growing desire to leave, they decided that they needed to understand what had really happened before they left. What they had seen was impossible to ignore, and curiosity mixed with terror led them to investigate further. The next morning, right after breakfast, one of the friends suggested they go to the nearest town to try to find out something about the lake and the figure they had seen. Maybe there was some explanation, an old story that could shed light on the strange events. When they arrived in town, they went straight to the small local library, where they began to search for any mention of the lake and its mysteries. It didn't take long for them to find something that sent chills down their spines. In an edition of a local newspaper from decades ago, there was a headline that read, "Fisherman disappears at lake under mysterious circumstances." The article told the story of a man named Samuel, a fisherman well known in the region. He was often seen fishing alone at the lake, and one day he simply vanished. His fishing chair and rod were found on the shore, but there was no sign of him. The lake was searched, but his body was never found. The local community was frightened, and soon rumors began to circulate that Samuel's spirit still haunted the lake, doomed to fish forever. The friends exchanged looks, each trying to process what they had read. The description of the fishing rod and chair matched exactly the items they had found on the lake's shore. It was clear that the figure they had seen wasn't a living man, but rather the spirit of Samuel, trapped in an endless cycle of his last fishing trip. "So that's it," one of the friends said, trying to stay calm. "The fisherman we saw was Samuel. He's stuck in that lake, repeating the same thing every day. But why did he appear to us now?" another friend asked. "He must have been there for decades. What did we do to catch his attention?" No one had an answer, but they all felt that they had awakened something by entering Samuel's territory. Now, they had to decide what to do. Was it dangerous to return to the lake? Were they being hunted by a spirit seeking revenge? Or had they merely witnessed a harmless supernatural event? The third friend, the most cautious, suggested they simply leave and let the lake and Samuel's spirit be. "Let's get out of here before something worse happens," he said, clearly shaken. But one of the friends, driven by a nearly morbid curiosity, wanted to return to the lake. He believed they could say goodbye to Samuel in some way, maybe even help him find peace. Despite the tension among the friends, they all agreed that they needed to go back to the lake, even if it was just to collect their things and leave. Time was running out, and night was approaching quickly. With heavy hearts and a mix of fear and determination, the three friends returned to the lake. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red as the shadows of the trees lengthened, creating a scene straight out of a nightmare. The silence that once seemed relaxing was now oppressive, as if the lake itself was waiting for them. Arriving at the camp, the friends began to gather their things, avoiding looking at the lake as much as possible. But the air was thick with a tension that was impossible to ignore. Every small noise, every leaf rustling in the wind, made them jump. The friend who had suggested they return to say goodbye to Samuel hesitated for a moment. He knew this was the last opportunity to try to do something to help the fisherman's spirit. He approached the shore of the lake, looking out over the dark, silent water. And with a firm voice, he began to speak. "Samuel," he said, trying to stay calm, "we know what happened to you. We didn't come here to disturb your rest. We're leaving, and we hope you can find peace." For a moment, it seemed that nothing would happen. The lake remained calm, the water still under the dying light of the day. But then, something began to change. Gentle ripples formed on the water's surface, moving toward the shore where the friend stood. He took a step back, fear beginning to take hold, but he forced himself to stand still. The water seemed to respond to his words. The ripples grew in intensity until suddenly Samuel's figure emerged from the water, just as it had on previous nights. But this time, he didn't seem hostile. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, and he stood on the shore, just watching the friend. The other two friends, paralyzed by fear, watched from a distance, not knowing what to do. The friend on the shore, feeling there was a connection, continued, "We don't need to stay here. You're not alone. You can rest now." For a moment, everything went silent again. Then, slowly, Samuel's figure began to dissipate as if he was finally unraveling. He was no longer the solid, disturbing figure he had been before. He was transforming into a shadow that blended with the mist beginning to rise from the lake. And then he disappeared completely, leaving no trace. The ripples in the water ceased, and the lake returned to its original stillness. The three friends stood still, unsure of what to think. The fear that had accompanied them throughout the trip seemed to have diminished, replaced by a sense of relief and melancholy. They knew that somehow they had helped Samuel find the peace he so desperately needed. Without saying a word, they finished packing up the camp and began the walk back to the car. Night had already fallen, and darkness enveloped them as they moved away from the lake. When they finally reached the car, they were all exhausted, but relieved. The friend who had spoken to Samuel looked back at the lake one last time before getting into the car. There were no more signs of Samuel or any other strange presence. The lake was, at last, at peace. As they drove back to town, no one spoke much. The experience had been too intense to discuss immediately. They knew that the story would stay with them forever. A reminder that there are things that can't be fully explained or understood, but they also knew that they had done the right thing. When they arrived home, they promised never to return to the lake. And although fear and mystery still lingered in their memories, they also carried the certainty that they had helped a lost spirit finally find rest. The day dawned with a clear, cloudless sky, promising a rare tranquility. Marcos and his son Lucas decided that this would be the perfect weekend to escape the frenetic routine of city life. The idea was simple: camping and fishing, just like Marcos used to do when he was a child. The destination was an isolated lake, hidden deep within a dense forest, where nature seemed untouched by time. The journey to the lake was uneventful. The dirt road, full of twists and turns, cut through the thick forest, where the only sounds were the tires crunching over stones and the distant songs of birds. Marcos spoke enthusiastically about the stories from his childhood, describing how the lake was a secret paradise, a place few people knew about. Lucas, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, listened attentively, already imagining the adventures they would have. They arrived at the lake in the early afternoon. The scenery was even more beautiful than Marcos remembered. The water was so clear that you could see the bottom, even in the deepest parts, and the trees around the lake seemed to form a green wall, protecting the area from any intrusion. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the gentle sound of the water moving and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Marcos and Lucas set up their tent with ease. and were soon ready to fish. Everything seemed perfect, as if the outside world had been forgotten. The two sat by the edge of the lake, cast their lines into the water, and patiently waited for the first catch of the day. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching as if the clock had stopped. The sun gradually descended on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Then came the first sign that something was wrong. Marcos noticed that the wind, which had previously been blowing gently, had suddenly stopped. The calm was so abrupt that even the birds had stopped singing. Amidst this silence, something subtler began to be heard. At first, Marcos thought it was his imagination, but soon the sound became unmistakable. Whispers coming from somewhere in the forest around the lake. He frowned and looked at Lucas, who didn't seem to notice anything, still focused on his fishing line. Marcos shook his head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling, attributing the whispers to the wind playing among the trees. But the wind was no longer there. As much as he tried to convince himself that it was nothing, a small seed of unease began to grow in his mind. The afternoon turned into dusk, and the whispers seemed to blend into the environment, becoming part of the very nature around them. Marcos said nothing to Lucas, deciding it was better not to scare him. But the feeling that something was watching them, something invisible and subtle, continued to bother him, even as the sun finally disappeared, plunging the lake into darkness. Night fell quickly, bringing with it an almost palpable darkness. The only light came from the small campfire Marcos had lit near the tent, casting dancing shadows on the trees around them. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but not enough to dispel the sense of discomfort that had settled in Marcos since the whispers began. Lucas, still unaware of his father's unease, was excited about the idea of spending the night outdoors. He talked non-stop about the things they would do the next day, like catching the biggest fish in the lake and exploring the nearby forest. Marcos listened with a smile, but his attention was divided. His ears were attuned, trying to catch any strange sound coming from the darkness. Then Lucas suddenly stopped talking and fell silent, staring intently at the fire. Noticing the change in his son's behavior, Marcos asked if everything was all right. Lucas took a few seconds to respond, still staring at the flames. "Dad, did you hear that?" he finally asked, his voice low and hesitant. Marcos felt a chill down his spine. He tried to remain calm as he asked, "Hear what, son?" The whispers," Lucas replied, his voice now trembling slightly. "It sounds like someone is talking, but I can't understand what they're saying." Marcos swallowed hard. He didn't want to scare Lucas, but he couldn't deny what he himself was feeling. The sound was there, coming from somewhere among the trees. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but constant, like a distant murmur. It wasn't the wind, and he knew it. "It's probably just the wind playing with the leaves," Marcos tried to reassure his son, forcing a smile. "Sometimes nature makes these strange sounds." But Lucas didn't seem convinced. He moved closer to his father, his eyes now reflecting the unease that Marcos felt. The silence around them was almost absolute, except for the whispers, which now seemed a bit closer. "Dad, I don't like this," Lucas murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "Can we go into the tent?" Marcos nodded, trying to hide his own apprehension. They extinguished the fire and entered the tent, carefully closing the zipper. The interior offered some protection, but the whispers could still be heard, now muffled by the nylon walls. Lying in their sleeping bags, Marcos and Lucas tried to settle in, but the atmosphere inside the tent was charged with tension. Marcos could hear his son's heart beating rapidly, almost in sync with his own. He closed his eyes, trying to force himself to sleep, but his mind was racing, imagining what could be causing those sounds. Time passed slowly. With each minute that dragged on, the whispers seemed to grow stronger, as if something was getting closer. Marcos felt helpless, unable to explain or understand what was happening. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination, but he knew that Lucas was also hearing the whispers. Marcos's anxiety peaked when, for a brief moment, he thought he heard a distinct word among the murmurs. Something that sounded like a name, his son's name. Marcos felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but when he tried to listen more closely, the sound vanished, returning to just an indistinct murmur. He knew he needed to do something. But what? Going outside the tent seemed like a bad idea, but staying there, surrounded by that invisible presence, was also terrifying. The only thing Marcos was sure of was that something was very wrong, and that night was far from over. The night was at its peak, plunging the lake and the surrounding forest into impenetrable darkness. Inside the tent, Marcos and Lucas remained awake, their bodies tense and minds alert, trapped in a forced silence that felt as oppressive as the darkness outside. The whispers, though still present, had become a constant background noise, as if they were part of the environment around them. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a new sound, something that made Marcos's heart skip a beat. It came from afar, but it was unmistakable, a chant. It wasn't a joyful or comforting sound. On the contrary, there was something deeply disturbing about that melody. It was slow, almost hypnotic, with a cadence that seemed to drag the soul to a dark, unknown place. Lucas grabbed his father's arm, his fingers squeezing tightly. Marcos looked at his son, seeing the fear etched in his eyes. He himself felt a wave of terror spreading through his body, but he knew he had to stay calm, at least in front of Lucas. "Dad, what is that?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. Marcos had no answer. He knew this place from his childhood, but he had never experienced anything like this. The chant seemed to come from all directions, reverberating among the trees, making the air around them vibrate with a dark energy. It was as if the forest had come to life, a life that shouldn't exist. "Stay calm, son," Marcos replied, trying to sound confident, but feeling his voice falter. It could be some animal or someone camping on the other side of the lake. But the words sounded hollow even to him. Marcos knew they were the only ones there. There was no sign of other people, no tracks, nothing to suggest anyone else was around. And even if there were, what kind of person would sing such a strange and unsettling melody in the middle of the night? Unable to ignore the sound, Marcos reached for the flashlight lying next to his sleeping bag. He hesitated for a moment, considering the possibilities, before deciding that he needed to investigate. Perhaps, if he saw what was happening, he could understand and, hopefully, ease the growing fear in his chest. "Stay here, Lucas," he said, trying to sound firmer. "I'll go see what's going on. Don't worry, I'll be back quickly." Lucas looked at his father with wide eyes, but said nothing. He just nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. Marcos felt a pang of guilt as he left his son alone, but he knew he couldn't just sit there while that sinister chant continued to draw closer. Marcos stepped out of the tent, feeling the cold, dense night air wrap around his body like a cloak. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly as he swept its beam around, but all he saw were the shadows of the trees, stretching and contorting as he moved. The chant, however, did not stop. In fact, it seemed to be getting louder, clearer, as if the source was approaching. Marcos felt a shiver run down his spine. when he realized that the sound wasn't coming from the lake, as he had initially thought, but from the forest surrounding the campsite. He took a hesitant step toward the trees, his mind torn between the desire to discover the source of the sound and the instinct to flee as quickly as possible. The ground beneath his feet felt less solid, as if he were treading on unfamiliar territory, even though he knew this was the same place he had walked many times before. Suddenly, the chant stopped, cutting through the air like a knife. Marcos froze, gripping the flashlight tightly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the chant itself, charged with a tension that set his nerves on edge. Marcos swept the flashlight around, his eyes straining to catch any movement, any sign of what might have caused that sound. But the darkness seemed alive, pulsing around him, hiding everything beyond the small circle of light. And then, out of nowhere, a new wave of whispers arose, this time so close that Marcos could almost feel the air vibrating around him. He instinctively stepped back, sensing that something was very, very wrong. There was no one there, but the whispers were almost inside his head, repeating a melody he couldn't understand but that filled him with an indescribable terror. Determined not to stay there for another second, Marcos turned and ran back to the tent, feeling the shadows closing in behind him. When he entered, panting and with his heart racing, he found Lucas sitting in the middle of the tent, his eyes wide and fixed on the entrance as if he were waiting for something. The chant didn't return, but the whispers continued, now seeming to come from all sides. Marcos knew they couldn't stay there. Something was surrounding them, something they didn't understand and that didn't belong to this world. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. "As soon as dawn breaks, we're leaving." Lucas just nodded, but the fear in his eyes said it all. They were in a place where the normal rules of reality seemed to have been distorted, and whatever was out there didn't want them to leave. The sky remained shrouded in dense, impenetrable darkness, as if the night itself refused to give way to dawn. Inside the tent, Marcos and Lucas stayed awake, trapped in a constant state of alert. Fear had become something tangible, a suffocating presence that wouldn't let them breathe easily. Marcos tried to think of a solution, but his mind was clouded by panic. The chant had stopped, but the whispers continued, sometimes coming closer, sometimes moving away, as if they were playing with their nerves. There was a growing sense that something was waiting, watching, and that its moment to act was approaching. "Dad," Lucas whispered, breaking the silence that had dragged on for hours. "Did you hear that?" Marcos looked at his son, noticing the pallor on his face. He nodded slowly, saying nothing. He had heard it too. Something more than just whispers this time. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving among the trees. He knew they could no longer ignore it. They needed to see what was out there, or the uncertainty would destroy them before anything else actually happened. "Stay close to me," Marcos said, trying to sound firm. "We'll take a look, but we'll come back quickly. And no matter what happens, don't let go of me." Lucas nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but without hesitation. He was terrified, but he trusted his father. Together, they unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold night, the flashlight trembling slightly in Marcos's hand as he pointed it into the darkness. The world outside seemed even stranger and more distorted than before. The shadows of the trees were long and twisted, resembling grotesque, almost human forms that moved as the light touched them. The silence was broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that had once been comforting, but now seemed threatening. The footsteps they had heard seemed to have disappeared, but Marcos didn't trust the calm. He led Lucas carefully, moving just far enough from the tent to see around but without losing sight of their way back. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every noise seemed a harbinger of danger. Suddenly, the flashlight illuminated something that made Marcos stop abruptly. Not far away, among the trees, there was an indistinct figure. It wasn't clear, as if it were shrouded in a mist that distorted its shape. It seemed humanoid, but something was wrong. Its movements were erratic, as if it didn't know how to move properly, or as if it were being guided by something beyond its will. Lucas saw the figure too and gripped his father's hand tightly, his body trembling with fear. Marcos instinctively moved to protect him, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure, hoping the light would drive it away. But instead, the figure simply stopped and stood there, motionless, as if watching them. Dread filled Marcos. He knew they should run, but something in the figure's eyes, if it had eyes, kept him rooted in place. A feeling that if he looked away, something terrible would happen. The whispers around them seemed to intensify, almost becoming distinct voices, speaking a language he couldn't understand. Finally, with supreme effort, Marcos broke the spell that seemed to bind him. He pulled Lucas, who was still paralyzed with fear, and began to back away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. It didn't move, but Marcos felt its gaze, if it had a gaze, fixed on them, filled with an insatiable hunger. As they retreated, Marcos noticed something even more disturbing. The path back to the tent seemed different. The trees that had once been familiar now seemed to have shifted position, creating a labyrinth of shadows that shouldn't be there. Every step they took seemed to lead them further from where they should be. Despair grew inside Marcos, but he knew he had to stay calm for Lucas' sake. He forced himself to remember how they had arrived there, trying to mentally trace the path back. But the more he tried, the more confusing the environment seemed to become. Then, with a warning, the whisper stopped, leaving a profound and absolute silence. Marcos's flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. Marcos tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it wouldn't respond, as if the night itself had decided there would be no more light for them. Trapped in the darkness, with the oppressive feeling that the figure was still watching them, Marcos knew they were at the mercy of something they couldn't comprehend. He pulled Lucas close to him, silently promising to get them out of there. But as the shadows around them seemed to close in even more, he wondered if they would survive until dawn. The darkness around Marcos and Lucas seemed to take on a life of its own, enveloped in a disturbing silence, as if the entire world was waiting for something terrible. With the flashlight out, and no other point of reference beyond the twisted trees around them, Marcos felt a wave of despair growing inside him. He knew he needed to be strong for Lucas, but the feeling of being lost in a forest that shouldn't feel unfamiliar was consuming him. "Dad," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "What are we going to do?" Marcos swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He hugged Lucas tightly, trying to convey a sense of security that he didn't feel himself. "We'll stay together," Marcos said, trying to keep his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we won't let go of each other." They began to walk blindly, guided only by intuition and the vague memory of where they believed the tent to be. Every step seemed to echo in the darkness, as if they were the only living beings in that place. But Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following them, hidden among the shadows, watching their every move. The temperature dropped drastically, the air becoming cold and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Marcos began to feel a slight tingling on his skin, as if something invisible was passing through them, a subtle but undeniably real presence. Lucas, beside him, started trembling, and Marcos realized his son was muttering incoherent words, as if he were in a trance. "Lucas, look at me," Marcos said, his voice filled with urgency. He shook his son gently, trying to bring him back to reality. "Stay with me. Don't drift away." Lucas blinked as if waking from a dream, but his eyes were still vacant, lost in a distant point. Marcos felt a pang of deep fear as he realized the invisible presence around them was affecting his son in a way he couldn't understand. He pulled Lucas closer, feeling that time was against them. Then, without warning, the whispers resumed, this time so close they seemed to come from inside Marcos's own head. He instinctively covered his ears, but the sound didn't stop, pulsing in his brain like an unbearable buzzing. He could hear words forming, but not in a language he knew. It was something ancient, primitive, filled with a malice that chilled his blood. Marcos looked around desperately, trying to find any sign of where they were, some way to escape the invisible torment. Then he saw it. The shadow. Not a common shadow, but a presence that seemed to absorb all light around it. An indistinct form standing just a few meters away. It had no face, no defined body, but it was there, and he could feel its gaze fixed on them. Lucas, still muttering, began to walk toward the shadow as if drawn by an invisible force. Marcos grabbed his son's arm tightly, preventing him from moving forward. He knew that if Lucas reached that thing, something terrible would happen, something he couldn't allow. "Lucas, stop!" Marcos shouted, his voice filled with panic. He pulled his son back, and for the first time since the night began, Lucas resisted, trying to break free from his father's grip. The shadow didn't move, but Marcos felt its presence intensify, as if it were about to strike. He needed to act quickly. With a final effort, he enveloped Lucas in a tight embrace, forcing him to look at him. "Lucas, listen to my voice," Marcos said, his voice now soft but full of urgency. "You need to stay with me. We're going to get out of here, but you need to help me. Stay with me, please." For a moment, Lucas stopped resisting, his eyes coming back into focus. He looked at his father, confused, as if waking from a nightmare. "Dad, what's happening?" Lucas asked, his voice weak and trembling. "Don't worry," Marcos replied quickly. "We're together. That's all that matters right now." He looked at the shadow, still there, motionless, but clearly aware that its prey was slipping away. Marcos knew they couldn't stay there any longer. He pulled Lucas even closer and began to back away slowly, never taking his eyes off the figure. Every step was a struggle against the instinct to run, but Marcos knew that if they ran, they might be lost forever. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they made it back to the tent. The place that had once seemed safe now felt like a fragile shield against the terror outside. Marcos zipped up the tent with trembling hands and sat down next to Lucas, who was still visibly shaken. The whispers quieted again, but the presence did not disappear. It was there, outside, waiting. Marcos felt the pressure in his chest increase, a sense that time was running out. He knew that night wouldn't end well, but he had to keep Lucas safe, no matter the cost. He took his son's hand and squeezed it, trying to offer some comfort. But deep down, Marcos knew they were being tested, that something was challenging them to hold on until dawn. And he could only pray that daylight would bring some salvation before that dark presence claimed what it wanted. The darkness remained impenetrable, and time seemed to drag on, each second longer and more agonizing than the last. Inside the tent, Marcos and Lucas remained still, their bodies tense, as if any movement could trigger an attack from the presence lurking outside. The air was charged with invisible electricity, and Marcos knew they couldn't stay there much longer. The silence around them was deafening, interrupted only by the irregular sound of their breathing. Marcos felt his heart hammering in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he tried to formulate a plan. The only certainty he had was that they needed to get out of there. And fast. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sky began to lighten slightly. It wasn't exactly dawn, but a faint twilight that indicated the sun was approaching the horizon. The weak light was enough to renew Marcos's determination. He knew this was the moment to act before something more sinister happened. "Lucas," he whispered, his voice firm but gentle, "we need to leave now. We're going to get out of this tent and run as fast as we can to the car. Don't look back, okay? Just keep going forward. I'll be right by your side." Lucas looked at his father, still visibly shaken, but nodded. He knew his father was doing his best to protect him, and that trust gave him the strength to move forward. Marcos slowly unzipped the tent, the sound seeming strangely loud in the silence of the forest. He peeked outside, the early morning light beginning to illuminate the lake and the trees around them. The scene looked normal, but Marcos knew it was an illusion. The presence was still there, even if he couldn't see it. With a nod, he signaled for Lucas to step out. They both stood up, their muscles tense and ready to run. They began to walk quickly toward the car, staying close together. Marcos kept glancing around, expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment to stop them from escaping. But nothing happened. The tension was almost unbearable, and every step they took seemed to echo through the forest floor. But the car was getting closer. Marcos could see the faint glint of metal through the trees and felt a wave of relief. Then, suddenly, the chant started again. This time, it was louder, more intense, as if it were coming from all directions at once. The sound was terrifying, a dark melody that seemed to want to pull them back into the darkness. Lucas started running, and Marcos followed, fear driving their movements. The trees around them seemed to close in on them, the shadows lengthening and twisting in impossible ways. Marcos felt the presence again, now stronger, more determined not to let them leave. The chant was almost deafening, a cacophony of voices that invaded his mind and pushed him to the brink of despair. Finally, they reached the car. Marcos unlocked the doors with trembling hands and shoved Lucas inside before jumping into the driver's seat. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life like a promise of salvation. Without hesitation, he accelerated, the tires screeching on the asphalt as the car sped out of the campsite. As they drove down the dirt road, the chant faded until it disappeared completely. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave them. Marcos drove as fast as he could, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirrors, expecting to see that shadow again. When they finally reached the main road, Marcos pulled over. He and Lucas sat in silence, their hearts still pounding. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, bathing everything in golden light. But the terror of the night was still fresh in their minds. "Are we safe now?" Lucas asked, his voice low and hesitant. Marcos looked at his son and forced a smile. "Yes, we're safe," he said, but there was uncertainty in his tone. They had escaped, but what exactly had been in that place? And why had they been targeted? As they drove home, the lake and forest already seeming distant, Marcos tried to find answers, but the more he thought, the less sense it all made. The only thing he knew for sure was that they wouldn't be returning to that place. Something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed, had made its presence known, and they had been lucky to get out alive. When they finally arrived home, the weight of the night began to dissipate, replaced by the familiarity and safety of home. But both Marcos and Lucas knew that what happened at that lake wouldn't leave them so easily. The shadow, the whispers, the chant, everything was etched in their minds, a mystery that would never be fully resolved. And even as they tried to return to their normal lives, a part of them would always look back to that night and wonder what really happened there. And were they truly safe? Slack species